All right, so this is the Walbro EPA version, which is a WJ115 carburetor. I don't know if you can see that. And okay, so you saw that we got the cylinder off. I started cleaning this up a little bit, but breaking down the rest of this is pretty easy. You know, I've taken the band, loosened that to pop this off the cylinder. Everything else is straightforward. It's basically everything is attached. You can see the head of the bolt here and where it daylights right there. So there's two of them, one lower on the left, one higher on the right. And I've just counted the threads here, but where it daylights on this plastic, I guess you would call it holder or sleeve that the rubber intake boot fits through, there's around 4 full threads. So that'll, if I don't use the specified torque, that'll get me pretty close. It is important not to over tight them. It's also because that will cause leaks and potentially crack the plastic here. But also, if you don't have it tight enough, I mean, these boots are classic for where you would get air leaks. It's also good to inspect for cracks if you're going to reuse. And although I did use a screwdriver to kind of loosen up and pry open this rubber boot, it seems fairly sound. I don't know that I want to go to the expense to replace it, but it's in good shape. So I could save myself some money by reusing that. And I think all of these bits I can reuse, including the fuel lines, but fuel lines are so cheap, I may end up, of course, as you take these apart, you got to make sure you're careful you don't get too much gunk in the middle of these. This is the impulse, whoops, sorry about that. This is the impulse line right here. This is where the fuel line comes into the carb, and then on the top, this is that impulse hose. So all you got to do is just loosen up those 2 bolts, and everything's going to come apart real nicely. So I'm not going to do that on camera here, just kind of showing you that. The non-EPA version of the carb is a WJ119. However, just let me show you that. So the real difference is, if you notice right here on the carb adjusting screws, there is a little metal shroud around the actual screw. This is the EPA version, and that'll depress in. And all you need is, I think in the past they were not, you couldn't get a hold of them, but now they're readily available. They're a 21 spline carb adjusting screw. So for those guys who just only want to use a slotted screwdriver, I can understand the inconvenience of carrying that around if you think you're going to need to be adjusting your carb frequently. But once you get it dialed in, that's not much of a need. But they're readily available, they're very cheap, and so there's no need to try and take all this apart, grind off the tab like you may have seen on YouTube, reinstall them so that you can just use your slotted screwdriver for adjusting. So I'm not going to really go to that extra effort to modify that. But that's, as far as I can tell on the exploded parts diagram, the only fundamental difference between the 115 and the 119 carburetor is whether or not it has those delimiter caps on them or not. So, all for now. All right, so you learn all kinds of stuff doing this work. So if you look at the exploded parts diagram, they show these as all separate pieces. This inlet pipe, which mounts the side that my hand is on, mounts on the cylinder. And then you have this little housing or collar that fits into the carb box and seals off the carb box. And then you have this little doohickey, whatever you want to call it here, which has a rubber washer and some hard bits and pieces to it, and that mounts onto the back side of the carb. And you know, the IPL suggests that this can all be taken apart. Yeah, I don't think so. I can't see a means to open up this plastic housing, nor to get any of this through the housing and to break it down. I suppose you might be able to, and you can see that there's hard metal in here. There might be a means to pry all that apart, but I think that all comes in one piece. Anyway, if it all comes in different bits and pieces, you might want to, I don't know, to me it's going to be a hassle to take that apart. So hopefully you can reuse these. Otherwise, you might have to purchase all these parts and figure out how to put them together if they don't come pre-assembled in a kit. So just something to look out for if you're gonna rebuild a saw or a saw like this that has a similar setup. All right, Bowman back here, saw enthusiasts. So on my last short video or clip, probably part of a longer video, I showed you, no, there must have been about 5 or 6 parts together as part of the carburetor intake assembly, and I did confirm that all those parts, they can be disassembled, they can be assembled, but they do come together as a kit. If you end up having to replace more than one of those little bits and pieces, you probably should just get a new one of the kits. Okay, so continuing on with this 394, I guess, teardown before we rebuild it. We pretty much decided that we have to rebuild the whole thing. I do believe if I really wanted to, I could get by with the crank and the bearings in this thing. But because I don't like the fact that there's a little bit of leakage at the seam on the oil tank, I want to crack this thing completely back open. So when I do that, I'll take a closer look at the crank and the bearings to decide whether I'm going to reuse them. My guess is I don't know, we'll see. If I'm going to go to that kind of effort, it kind of makes sense, as long as hopefully the crank is good, to just go ahead and replace the bearings. That's always an onerous process. At least it's something I've always feared. I've tried to avoid splitting and doing anything in the bottom end other than, you know, getting down and replacing the crank seals, I guess. I was a saw user, and do routine maintenance, but was never a builder or anything. I guess it just scared me, and I've come to learn that there's no reason for that. And I want a shout out to Tin Man. His videos are great, and some recent videos he did on a 288, and you might recall I'm in the process of upgrading an old 281 carcass into a 288. Some really good advice and a great video, live, no cuts, showing how to go about building the bottom end. And it's not going to be much different, I don't think, for a saw like this. And he actually makes it a little bit simpler than the workshop service manual suggests. So there's more than, you know, one way you can go about a lot of these little tasks, but I really like the beauty, the simplicity of the method that Tin Man demonstrated. It's still, you know, it's methodical. It makes a lot of common sense. But yeah, I think it really helps people like me that are just getting into this, inspired me, and or gives me the extra confidence and courage to actually break these things open. So what I'm going to do here is just slowly start breaking down the rest of this crankcase and handle assembly. So at this point in the 372 teardown process, you now have to, you know, get the handle and tank assembly off, and to do that, you've at this point you now have to take off this carb box, as I call it. I don't know if that's the correct term. And what you'll be doing there is needing to undo The 3 additional bolts, I've already undone the one here that was holding in, I believe it was the part of the ignition system. And so 3 bolts, and then we'll be pulling through the main fuel line, the tank vent, and the throttle cable. After that, then, you know, off camera, I'll be obviously cleaning up the box. Then we will have to tackle removing the ABs, and actually these bolts, at least the 2 back here, they're part of the vertical AV system as opposed to the horizontal AV systems that you typically see on most saws, particularly the 300 and 200 series saws that Husky made. All right, so without any further ado, we'll just progress with that. And so as usual, you're going to be using the most common Allen wrench for taking apart most of the bits and pieces on a Husky, and that's a 4mm Allen. I think some of the newer saws are actually going to Torx, and I've actually replaced a few bolts on some of my 281s with both Torx and Allen. Some of the old bolts were actually hex heads, which, boy, man, I always hated having to find a damn hex head socket to undo some of the AV and muffler mounts on my original 281. And so what I'll do here is probably reattach some of these bolts back to the case or the AV mount so I know where they go. Otherwise, I will find a little baggies and put a label on it so that I know where things go. So as I suspected, now everything's loose here. And the only tricky part to this that I'm aware of is going to be getting the hoses and the cable through here. Now you notice I plugged the fuel line with a little bit, and I did that just to cut down on any residue fuel and odor that was coming into my, just like that, into my finished basement. I'm going to hear about this now. This will permeate through the house. So I'm going to go off camera here and get this cleaned up and take my lickings from my better half. All right, let's reboot. Let's see if we can do this without making too much of a stinky mess. I heard about it. So, there, I'm able to get that down. That's the main fuel line. And then there's a grommet on the vent line. Maybe you can see that back in here. And you can either filter that. I think I can probably get it down. Well, maybe not. Might be easiest to just try and pull that up over the vent tube. The one thing I don't understand is their design on this vent tube. It's a little different. And they actually, if you read the manual, service manual, they advocate just when you're going to replace it to just break it off inside the tank. That just, I don't know, that doesn't sit well with me. So this is, because it's a relatively new saw, I am not going to try and break that off and go through the effort of completely replacing that. So what I'm doing here is just moving this grommet up and hoping I can do so. There we go, once I get it loose without causing too much stress on the whole thing. And I'm just going to be careful not to plug this sintered bronze filter at all, and I'm just going to slip this grommet hopefully up and over the assembly here and be able to reuse the grommet. I hate to have to spend several bucks or try and spend the time to track down an equivalent replacement aftermarket. So there we go. We'll set that aside with the bolts. So now these hoses will move fairly freely through here. The cable, as you can see, is going to move freely through that, let's just call it a rectangular grommet. Once I get it up enough, I can pull that through. Same thing with the vent tube. And the big trick here is, just in case I still have some fuel, I did crack the tank cap a little bit. Hopefully things aren't under pressure, but now I'm just going to pinch that hose so I'm not going to get any more fuel residue coming out. If you have a hemostat or something like that, you could use that to kind of do the same thing. It does fit tightly through that hole, to try and minimize, instead of using a grommet, they have a fairly tight hole there. So anyway, I'm going to plug that back up and retighten my gas cap. So now I've managed fumes, and now you can see what we're dealing with. You can now see the handle, and the handle is almost completely loose. There's a bolt here that does not appear to be connected to any buffer or AV mount. I would assume that you could potentially find a buffer, or maybe the buffer was missing and this saw was taken apart once already. And so that'll prevent you from taking this handle off. There's another bolt over here on this side kind of performing the same function, and I don't see any buffer over there, so maybe that's how it's designed. I'll have to look at the IPL. Apologize for the vacuum cleaner in the background. So basically all that's left here, there's a spacer, and I've got the bolt associated with it that the air filter housing mounts on. You've got the stop switch, you've got a grommet in here and there for the choke tube, here for the throttle cable. So we'll just get this cleaned up. I'm not going to go through any of that on screen. Pretty self-explanatory. Hopefully you're getting some benefit out of this if you're a do-it-yourselfer. And I'm by no means a professional and an expert at this. Alright, that's kind of an interesting little bolt there that goes into, for other saws, what I think would be a horizontal AV mount. But I need to take those out so I can continue to get this handle off. So there's one on this side, on the clutch side underneath where the clutch cover would be. I'm guessing this will be yep, same bolt. So those are easy to identify. So I might be able to just put those in with these other 3 carb box bolts. Keep track of them. Okay, so we're really close to coming off here. So there's 2 things up front I need to worry about before I can get this handle assembly off. Well, don't laugh at my crude setup here, guys. Like I said, I'm not a professional and I don't have a heated shop. I just don't want to work in freezing temps. All right, so I've released that AV mount, but I'm not done yet. I've taken off the spike or the dog mounting bolts. I've taken off a few other things on the saw, including the oiler bolts. I'm going to be opening this thing probably, so I just don't need any of that stuff attached. Don't want any of it attached. So it looks like the last little bit is going to be taking off this nut, which is on a rubber, I just call it a buffer. Actually, that's not holding it together, so it looks like I should be able to just lift this off. And indeed I can. So that really wasn't too difficult. There's just dealing with the hoses there. So that's how you get your tank assembly off of this 395. Now that case sits a little flatter, doesn't roll around as much. And then for cleaning this up, we'll take all the bits and pieces off. I may even break into the handle assembly here to make sure that's all nice and clean. And I'll take off these AV mounts, which looks like they just lock in place here. They slide in. So I'll take those off and get them cleaned up, but it's pretty straightforward, so I won't probably do that on camera. So I guess the next time, after I get the top end here or the bottom end cleaned up a little bit, I'll be removing these rubber buffers, which can be a pain to get both on and off. You know, because this case is likely going to get heated a little bit. So I want to take that off. So, but the next video after I get some stuff cleaned up will be removing these crank seals. I want to get the saw cleaned up first, because if I decide not to split the case, I don't want a bunch of dirt getting into the crank bearings and, you know, having to clean that out, although I could probably do it with blowing. But bottom line is, this is a well-used saw, and it's not terribly dirty or anything, but I just would like to get everything on the inside of the crankcase nice and clean. And again, we're dealing with this leaky situation right here at the oil tank that I don't want to have to deal with when I run a saw. So really speaks to the need to split this open. The surfaces here on the crankcase are nice. The gasket came off just beautifully. There was no residue left behind, nor was there any indication that there was a bypass or a leak going on there, just as with the crank seal. So at least in that regard, we're good. And, you know, I don't think we're dealing with much wear there. It kind of seems nice and true. I don't know if you can see this, but it does look like it's not perfectly centered, which may not be a huge deal, but it's a little wider gap over here than this side. So at the very minimum, you can see, even if I slide the rod over all the way, that, you know, it's not much, but we could crack that over real easy, even if we don't split the case. So we'll go into all this bits and these different bits and pieces of the tear down and rebuild in another video. All right, let's talk a little bit about the tank. You can see it cleaned up quite nicely. This AV mount just unbolts down here with a 4mm head. I put the bolts from the top mountings in there just so I don't lose them. I did confirm when I had taken out those bolts on the crankcase that inserted into these spaces here, that indeed there is no buffer there. So the bolts simply are a stopper to basically keep the handle from dropping out. I don't see any other function for them. I don't know that they even need to be in there once everything else is mounted, but they do prevent the handle from dropping out of the crankcase after you've got your AV mounts off. And they will bump up against this and cause a little bit of scoring and whatnot. So I'm kind of not sure whether those are truly needed, at least once you have the saw assembled. On these rear AV mounts, they slide out real easy. You just need a good screwdriver up here. It doesn't take much pressure at all. See how they slide out? The one thing to note though, if you're doing this and the saw's dirty and you don't clean up these channels, you may not be able to get these AV mounts back in fully. In fact, that was the case on this saw. It was sitting like this. So that might, I don't know, affect some alignment issues in reassembly. But they press in really easy. I do like these kinds of AV mounts. They're super easy to take apart and to clean. I really like that. Again, here's the tank vent. And this just presses in, and when you have to replace it, if this ever becomes, you know, stiff, then you're supposed to replace them, and basically you have to break it from the inside through the fuel tank cap, and then use an appropriate tool to try and get the rest of this out or pry it loose, and then you just take a new one and press it in. You can drift out the old broken part once you have this out with a drifter, I suppose. Pretty easy to deal with the handle here. I got it cleaned up. I don't have to drift out the pins here or here to do any servicing on it, but I do want to show you one thing. And you know, hopefully I can be successful at this. But you see there's a little receptacle for that cable, or the rubber shroud around the cable. That's easy to come off or slip out, and then that rubber moves a little more freely, but there's just a little trick there. Once you're servicing it, that might come out, and before you put things back together, you might notice that the rubber sleeve on that cable is moving freely, and that's how it's secured. Just a little FYI on that. So other than that, we have this tank handle pretty much all cleaned up, and haven't decided yet whether I'm going to replace the fuel lines. I think they look pretty good. I'll just put a new fuel filter on there. The sintered bronze vent plug at the end of the tube here looks real good. So the only issue I see at all with this handle is a little crack right here, and it's not bad at all. I could pry open the rubber insert here and take a closer look at it, but it doesn't really seem to flex a whole lot. And I think what I'm going to end up doing is just, if I feel the need, is sand any rough edge there and probably just bridge it with some JB weld just to give it the little added support. Other than that, you know, I think we can fully reuse this handle assembly. All right, so here's what we're going to be starting with on the car box after we start rebuilding. It was about a half hour between removing the parts, the bits on it, lightly scraping with a short, small handled straight edge, and then just using some Dawn dishwashing soap. It's all plastic once the bits are removed, and using pulsating spray off of my kitchen sink, and she's cleaned up very nice. So we'll be moving on to the crankcase to finish cleaning that up before we remove the crank seals and so forth.